Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling trade policy,
Okay.
specifically how it impacts American interests.
All right.
And we've got some pretty starkly contrasting viewpoints to kind of unpack and figure out what's going on.
Yeah. It's interesting because these different opinions on trade, they go beyond just economics. They really get at those core American values and anxieties, about America's place in the world.
Yeah, and how we should interact with the rest of the world.
Exactly.
So to get into this, we are diving into a chapter from Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise.
Okay.
It features two pretty strong voices on trade.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Navarro, who's all about fair trade,
Right.
and Kent Lastman, who champions free trade, and they do not hold back.
It's like a philosophical boxing match
Yeah.
where each punch is an argument about the best path forward for America in this globalized world.
All right, so let's
High stakes.
yeah,
Nice and
let's get into the ring with Navarro first.
Let's-
He comes out swinging, claiming that the U.S. is the globe's biggest trade loser,
Wow.
and he blames our chronic trade deficits for this.
Yeah, and he really emphasizes the human cost of these trade imbalances. So,
What?
Lost jobs, stagnant wages,
Mhm.
and a weakening of our manufacturing base.
And he even points to the WTO's most favored nation rule
Yes.
as a problem
Yeah,
because it allows other countries to take advantage of us
it does.
with higher tariffs than we charge them.
Yeah, basically putting American businesses at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and he uses this great example
Mm-hmm.
of the auto industry.
Okay.
So we have a 2.5% tariff on importing cars.
Okay.
The EU charges 10%,
Mm-hmm.
China charges 15%,
Wow.
and Brazil charges a whopping 35%.
Oof, it's a big difference.
Yeah.
Tough to compete.
And then Navarro doesn't just point fingers at everybody.
Okay.
He sees China's economic aggression as a major threat.
This is a big part of his argument. So he brings up things like currency manipulation, intellectual property theft,
Right.
forced technology transfer, even go so far as to say that China threatened to withhold pharmaceuticals during the pandemic
Wow.
as leverage.
Wow.
So he's painting a pretty stark picture.
So essentially he's advocating for a decoupling from China, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
essentially less trade, more bringing production back home
Yeah.
to the U.S.
So increased tariffs on Chinese goods, tax breaks to incentivize companies to come back to the U.S.,
Uh-huh.
and restrictions on Chinese investment in key industries.
Yeah, pretty drastic stuff.
Yeah, and to kind of give you a sense of the scale,
Okay.
we actually have a table here showing the U.S. trade deficit in goods with our top trading partners.
I'm looking at it now.
And surprise, surprise, China's at the top
By a long shot.
by a mile.
Yeah,
So this is a massive issue.
huge.
And Navarro argues it needs a radical solution.
Now let's hear from the other corner.
Okay.
Kent Lastman has a very different perspective.
Mm.
He sees free trade not just as an economic policy, but almost as a moral imperative.
Oh, wow.
A statement of American values.
So less about government intervention
Right.
and more about letting the market do its thing.
Absolutely. He believes in American entrepreneurs
Okay.
and the power of open markets.
Okay.
He's even skeptical of trade agreements that include all these extra things,
Like what kind of things?
like labor environmental or intellectual property regulations.
Why would he be against those?
His argument is that those are all important issues,
Right.
but they should be handled separately
Okay.
to allow trade agreements to focus solely on trade
Okay.
and to really succeed in their goal of liberalizing trade.
So how does he respond to that whole American manufacturing is dying narrative?
Well, he kind of flips the script.
Okay.
He points out that U.S. manufacturing output
Yeah.
is actually at an all-time high,
Right.
thanks to increased productivity.
No.
So it's not about making the same things we did decades ago. It's about adapting and being competitive in new ways.
Okay, so then what are the benefits of free trade, according to Lastman?
Well,
What's his pitch?
he lays out the classic arguments: lower prices for consumers,
Mm-hmm.
more specialization, and this is a key point: stronger alliances.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he sees free trade as a way to build stronger ties with our allies,
Okay.
which is especially important as China, flexes its muscles on the world stage.
So he's basically saying that protectionism
Yeah,
could actually make us weaker in the long run.
that's the gist of it.
Interesting.
He even uses the Jones Act as an example.
And the Jones Act is?
It's this law that requires goods shipped between U.S. ports to be transported on American-made, owned, and crewed ships.
Okay.
So it really drives up costs.
Wow.
It hurts our maritime industry.
Interesting.
And he even points out that it makes importing oil from Russia cheaper than shipping it domestically.
What?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
That seems counterproductive.
Yeah, Lastman argues it's a relic
Mhm.
of a bygone era. We have an $800 billion defense budget and a strong Navy.
Right.
So we don't need protectionist measures like that anymore.
Okay.
He wants to see the Jones Act scrapped.
Gotcha. So he also goes after those Trump-era tariffs, right?
Big time.
Yeah.
He sees them as harmful,
Mhm.
contributing to inflation and hurting consumers without achieving their goals.
So what does he propose?
Well, he wants to see them repealed
Okay.
and suggests rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right, the TPP
Mhm.
that Trump pulled us out of.
As a way to counter China's influence.
Okay, and to further back up his claim that American manufacturing is thriving,
Right. Yeah.
he offers this chart showing the steady rise of U.S. industrial production over the last century.
It's pretty compelling visual,
Yeah.
kind of counters that doom and gloom narrative that we often hear.
So we have Navarro, the fair trade warrior, calling for a strategic retreat from globalism, especially with China.
Mhm.
And we have Lastman, the free trade champion, arguing for American strength through openness and engagement.
Two very different approaches.
Wildly different approaches.
Yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
What are the consequences of each approach?
Right.
Are there hidden costs and benefits?
Yeah.
And ultimately, what does all this mean for you, the listener, in your daily life?
And that's what we're going to explore in part 2 of this deep dive.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've heard these two very different takes on trade, fair trade versus free trade.
Right.
But how do these ideas actually play out in the real world?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And I think to understand the impact, we need to look beyond these abstract arguments and think about some concrete examples.
Okay, so let's talk about that baby formula shortage
Yeah.
that we mentioned earlier.
Absolutely.
It seems like a perfect case study of what can go wrong when you have a lack of competition and reliance on a limited number of domestic producers.
Yeah. The U.S. market for baby formula was heavily protected,
Mm.
with high tariffs making it difficult for foreign companies to compete.
Right.
So this created a situation where a handful of domestic companies controlled almost the entire market.
And then boom, one of those companies has a major contamination issue at a plant.
Yeah.
And suddenly there's not enough formula to go around.
Right.
Parents are freaking out. Shelves are empty.
Yep.
Prices are skyrocketing.
It was chaos.
Yeah.
It really exposed the vulnerability of a system that prioritizes domestic production above all else.
Right.
If there had been more competition from foreign producers, the impact of that single plant closure might have been much less severe.
So does that mean free trade is the answer?
Well, it's not that simple.
Right.
There are legitimate concerns about the potential downsides of free trade, like job displacement in certain sectors. But I think the baby formula shortage does highlight the importance of having diverse and resilient supply chains.
Right. And what about the workers?
Yeah.
Navarro argues that fair trade policies are necessary to protect American jobs and wages. What's Lastman's counter to that?
Well, Lastman acknowledges that trade can lead to job losses in some industries, but he argues that it also creates new opportunities in other areas.
Okay.
He points out that overall free trade leads to a more dynamic and efficient economy, which ultimately benefits workers in the long run.
He also makes the point that technological advancements
Yeah,
and automation have a far greater impact on job displacement than trade.
absolutely.
So maybe we should be focusing on, preparing our workforce for the jobs of the future,
Right.
rather than trying to cling to
Yeah.
jobs in declining industries.
That's a key point.
Yeah.
Investing in education, training, and skills development is crucial
Right.
if we want American workers to thrive in a globalized economy.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay. Yeah.
Both Navarro and Lastman see China as a major challenge, but their approaches to dealing with it are night and day.
Yeah, it's almost like they're looking at two different countries.
Yeah.
Navarro sees China as an existential threat,
Yeah.
a hostile power that we need to disentangle ourselves from economically.
He's particularly concerned about their, aggressive pursuit of technological dominance.
Yes.
And their willingness to kind of flout international rules.
Right. And he argues that engaging with China through trade only makes them stronger and more emboldened.
But Lastman takes a more nuanced approach.
He does.
He's not naive about the challenges China presents.
Right.
But he believes that engagement through trade and diplomacy is ultimately a better strategy than isolation.
He argues that by remaining economically connected, we have more leverage to influence China's behavior
Okay.
and encourage them to adhere to international norms.
Hmm.
He even suggests that cutting ourselves off from China could push them closer to other authoritarian regimes,
Right.
creating an even bigger problem.
So once again, we have two contrasting viewpoints offering completely different solutions to the same problem.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the assumptions we bring to these debates.
Right.
And how they shape our perceptions.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that there are no easy answers when it comes to trade policy.
Right.
The best approach likely involves a complex balancing act between economic interests, national security concerns, and our values as a nation.
So we've heard from Navarro and Lastman, explored fair trade versus free trade, and even looked at the impact of these ideas on things like baby formula and jobs. But I'm curious, is this whole debate really a new thing? Have we always argued about trade this way in America?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. This isn't new. These debates have been raging for centuries in America.
Wow.
Back in the 19th century, tariffs and protectionism were really hot-button issues.
Interesting.
Some folks believed that shielding American industries from foreign competition was key to growth,
Hmm.
while others were all about the benefits of open trade.
Sounds familiar.
Right, like just swap out the industries and the countries involved, and it's the same argument we're having today.
Yeah, just different players.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that those debates often played out along regional lines.
Okay.
Certain industries and parts of the country benefited from protectionist measures, while others saw free trade as the path to prosperity.
So it really shows how economics and self-interest are always intertwined with these discussions.
Always.
Yeah.
And speaking of the global system, things have changed dramatically in recent decades.
Right.
The rise of China as a global economic power has thrown a wrench into a lot of our assumptions about trade and globalization.
Because China plays by a different set of rules, right?
Yeah, their state-controlled capitalism and aggressive pursuit of technology make them a very unique challenge.
Right.
It forces us to rethink traditional notions of free trade and consider whether those rules still apply when dealing with a competitor like China.
Okay, so we've talked about economics, national security, even a bit of history, but let's bring it back down to earth. How do these global trade dynamics actually affect the average person?
One of the most direct impacts is on your wallet. The prices of goods and services that you buy every day are influenced by trade policies.
Right.
If the U.S. adopts more protectionist measures like higher tariffs, those costs often get passed on to consumers.
So that new TV or those imported shoes could get more expensive?
Exactly. On the flip side, embracing free trade agreements could lead to lower prices.
Oh.
As businesses face more competition and consumers have access to a wider range of goods from around the world.
But we also have to think about jobs.
Right, of course.
Free trade can lead to companies moving production overseas, which can hurt American workers.
Yeah, that's a real concern, and it's why these debates are so complex.
Right.
While some jobs might be lost, trade also creates new opportunities, often in higher skilled industries.
Okay.
The key is to make sure that American workers are prepared for those new jobs through education and training.
So it's not a simple win-lose situation.
Not at all.
There are trade-offs, and the impact is felt differently by different people.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to have these discussions and consider all sides of the issue.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into trade, China, and American interests, what are the key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that there are no easy answers when it comes to trade policy.
Right.
It's a balancing act, weighing economic interests, national security, and our values as a nation.
And what might seem like a simple solution could have unintended consequences down the road.
Absolutely. That's why it's so vital to engage in thoughtful debate. Consider multiple perspectives and be wary of simplistic solutions.
Well said. This has been a fascinating exploration. I hope it sparks some new thoughts and questions for our listeners.
Remember, these are just two perspectives on a very complex issue.
Yeah.
We encourage you to continue researching, reflecting, and engaging in conversations about trade. It's an issue that affects us all.
Right.
And the choices we make will have a lasting impact.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time.